Let me give you a quick overview of what I intend to talk about today, just four primary sections. Uh, Talk about the cost of a breach, some of it monetarily and some of it non-monetarily. Um, Quickly go over some SEC disclosures from the past year, 6 months to 18 months, and talk about threat vulnerability management as it may relate to incident management. And then lastly, wrapping it up, what can you do after an incident? Okay. So I think it goes without saying that we all know that over time, the cost of a breach has just increased exponentially. Over the last 4 years, it's been over $9 million, and that's very expensive. So what are some of the additional costs that we need to consider when we start talking about a breach or preparing for it? One of them is training and awareness. And this comes in many different forms. Are you training your staff? Are they prepared for a cyber incident? Are they prepared for a breach? Are they prepared for spotting vulnerabilities or being able to remediate them in a timely fashion? This also comes in different forms: incident testing, tabletop exercises. Uh, Awareness. This comes down to how well you keep your employees in tip-top shape and be able to recognize a threat. It could be a phishing awareness campaign that you run or a social engineering awareness campaign that you run. Next up is compliance. There is definitely regulatory compliance that comes into play here when you need to start talking about vulnerability management and being ready for that. There's data protection, there's incident response, there's some stuff that comes into mind, FedRAMP with testing. We're having separate environments that are available just for incident response training. Another is employee morale. Making sure you're properly and adequately staffed. Are you doing capacity management planning on a yearly basis? Do you have the correct coverage to be able to meet your targets that you're aiming for metrics wise? Are they overworked? And do they have the resources and tools that they need in order to be successful? Another is incident response preparation. And this is one thing that I see very common in terms of not being prepared for people. A lot of people, they go off, or a lot of teams will go off and think that a tabletop exercise or a limited scope simulation is adequate. In reality, it's not. Going back through my time across different Fortune 100 companies, an actual real live simulated event is what's needed in terms of a failover and a failback to make sure that you're ready for an incident response. And I can talk from experience from my time at Wells. We actually had an incident happen in 2017 where we had a data center go down, and we actually had a very solid incident response. We were able to get our applications and services back on within 2 or 3 hours. So that's very important. A lot of documentation comes into that in terms of process, standard, procedure, and logs, and training logs. And that also feeds into documentation reporting. Do you have a good incident response plan documented? How well is your vulnerability management documentation ready? Based off a CDW report, 40.4% of financial services companies are ready for some kind of cybersecurity staffing if an incident happens. And that more so impacts financial services companies based off the report. Okay, so now we'll go into the SEC disclosures. So let's rewind the clock back about 18 months. And let's talk about the initial additional scope that was being required. And that was around the nature, scope, and timing of an incident. And this nature, timing, and scope really takes into account many different things. It could be the nature could be what type of breach was it? Was it ransomware? Was it tied to a vulnerability? What was the scope of it? Was it limited in nature to a handful of servers? Was it to your intranet only, or could it be to all of your internet exposing servers? The timing is also key. Understanding if it happens at a certain time of the year, definitely during financial services, end of the month is definitely a very critical time where there might be change freezes in place that are very critical. And there may be additional hurdles where if there is an incident, you need to have an emergency change ready to address that vulnerability if something were to come up. So based off these disclosures, generally within 4 business days, you need to have an incident that's deemed material, needs to be reported to the Attorney General. There are certain cases of that where if it's a national or public safety issue where it can be delayed. But what is material? Material is deemed as something that may be important to an investor if they're going to be making some kind of investment decision. So how does this all play into vulnerability management? Well, for one, you're talking about risk management. You're talking about vulnerability and patch management, asset and configuration management. And that feeds into the updated regulations, which came out just in July of this year, just a few months ago. So one of these is just being able to assess your material risk from cybersecurity. So how are you able to look at an attack that were to come in? How does your risk management play into that? Do you have a solid risk register in place? Are you performing risk assessment on your assets? What's your exception control process look like? All of these things kind of come into item number 4, which we'll talk about in a minute. Number 2 is being able to identify your material risks. So this feeds into being able to identify your assets adequately, understanding your attack surface, and being able to make any actions and determinations based off of that. Third is management. This is where the board of directors and having a governance committee comes into play. Being able to make decisions based off actions and that make sure they're quantifiable. So when you're going out and determining your attack surface and understanding you have an asset and a vulnerability tied to that. Do you understand if you were to bring that asset down, the amount of time and the cost per hour that's going to cost your company? So all of these kind of feed in together and being able to understand just the overall updates that were required. So if you do have some kind of material asset that is in place and you do have a ransomware, you do need to disclose the amount of this and the size of the ransomware payment that you make. You will need to disclose it if it's material in nature, even if insurance is covering the payment to make for the ransomware. And lastly, you may need to disclose any kind of cybersecurity events that occur in a series. It could be a single actor, it could be multiple actors, but you need to be able to quantitatively and qualitatively be able to describe the incidents that occur. And when I'm talking about quantitative, and that could be the dates, the number of people that are impacted, both internally to your company and externally. And lastly, how long an outage may occur for the disruption. Qualitative could just be anything from data exfiltration to anything from unanticipated access or operational disruption. So how does all this feed into threat and vulnerability management? So I've talked about some buzzwords so far today, and I think it really starts to help us understanding the 4 phases of the threat and vulnerability management lifecycle. Being able to identify and adequately prioritize your assets and remediating your vulnerabilities based on their environmental severity. So are you looking at your assets just from a CVE's perspective, or your vulnerabilities from a CVE's perspective, or are you looking at it from more of an environmental severity perspective? Is this a regulated environment? Is it production or non-production? These are all key things that help you identify things that are relative and then also prioritize vulnerability remediation. Another thing to look at is how can that be automated? Do you have anything that can go into a patch management process? And that feeds into remediation efforts. Being able to identify vulnerabilities that are tied to a specific vendor, like let's say Microsoft patches. Having a solid patch management process will help you be able to remediate those vulnerabilities. And lastly, one key major thing is reporting. Being able to speak to your metrics, to your leadership, talking about the efficacy of your program. And that all kind of feeds into like a strategy of how you can define this. So I've talked a bit about a board of directors and being able to stand that up in a governance committee. But let's talk about the 3 ways which are generally looked at in terms of your program. So initial stage is you have minimal or no strategy or governance. You're defining that. Your processes are very informal and you're just getting your tooling on board. And your ability to perform risk assessments may not be very well. And then as you adapt to that and you get better, you're starting to document some of this stuff. You've got a solid strategy set up now for governance. You've got operational processes and tooling that support this. And you're starting to integrate some of those supporting processes that I've talked about, such as change and knowledge management. And then lastly, being able to improve on that, implementing automation through the patch management process for one, deployment of code if you've got code developers through segregation of duties also, and being able to improve and enhance your operational processes. And then lastly, just having an executive dashboard that can talk to that efficacy of your program. So just real quickly, I want to talk about some vulnerability best practices. I'm only going to highlight a few of them. One is the governance committee, which is very important, obviously through the SEC disclosures, having a body that can be able to talk to and understand and assess the management of risk within your company. That's very important. Prioritization, being able to talk about the impact that the vulnerability has to your environment is key. Next, is really quickly want to talk about leveraging threat data and a quick story from my time at Wells Fargo. Threat data feeds into a SIM external, and you also have internal data that feeds into that. And being able to understand all of this data through a single pane of glass is very important. And then understanding where that data comes from and the type of data that's being fed into. Back in 2016, when I was at Wells, we had a zero-day threat come in, which was through Threat Intel, which was the Apache Struts, also known as the Equifax breach. My team and I were able to quickly remediate the vulnerability and fix this through understanding the data in the threat feed, understanding the indicators of it, the vulnerability that it represented, and the breadth of it. And there's obviously some benefits that come into effect when you have effective threat intelligence feeds, being able to prioritize your vulnerabilities, being able to remediate them in a timely manner, and having improved incident response. So how can you have a proactive incident response? One is preparation, just being able to and I know I've talked a lot about documentation and processes, but this is really key in being able to prepare and have a solid vulnerability management program that can meet the SEC guidelines. Being able to document a communication plan, having effective training, as I mentioned, and having defined roles and responsibilities. When it comes to the actual operational pieces of it, being able to identify, isolate, and eradicate, having processes in place for each of these, and being able to categorize your severities and incidents as it comes into play. When it comes into recovery, having solid recovery procedures and being able to have patch management processes that are in place to make sure that in testing that your recovery is complete. And then lastly, one of the most important that I've actually learned and seeing throughout multiple organizations and working with them is having a solid continuous improvement process. And that is being able to conduct a post-mortem to identify any root causes and how you can improve. And all this feeds into an incident response plan and being proactive. So finally, what do you do after an incident? One is be very proactive, build relationships with your local FBI office if you can, people within the industry if possible. If you do have an incident, contact the FBI or other agencies listed here. Perform a root cause analysis I mentioned, and also do perform and identify and document any important findings. And as I mentioned earlier, you have 4 days to disclose unless it's deemed by the U.S. Attorney General it needs to be outside of that. So that's it. Thank you.